20 years ago, GreenBridge Energy was running out of time. The company had exhausted most of its funding. Projects were being canceled. Employees were leaving. And industry analysts openly questioned whether the business would survive another year. Most investors walked away. One did not. An ordinary accountant named Thomas Bennett invested nearly everything he had saved over 2 decades. Friends called the decision reckless. Some called it foolish. Thomas called it necessary. He believed in what GreenBridge Energy was trying to build, and sometimes that was enough. Today, that investment was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet almost nobody working at GreenBridge Energy knew who Thomas Bennett was. Many had never heard his name. Most would not have recognized him if he walked through the front door. And on a Monday morning, that was exactly what he was about to do. Before the day was over, a group of senior executives would dismiss him as an uninformed outsider, and one employee would quietly remind everyone what leadership was supposed to look like. The train arrived shortly after 7 o'clock. Thomas Bennett stepped onto the platform carrying an old leather briefcase that had accompanied him through most of his professional life. The briefcase had seen better days. The corners showed signs of wear. The leather had softened over time. A small scratch near one clasp had been there for nearly 15 years. Thomas knew exactly how it had gotten there. And just like Daniel Foster's travel bag, he had never felt any need to replace it. Some things earn the right to grow old. The morning air felt cool and fresh. Thomas paused for a moment and looked toward the skyline. Somewhere among the glass towers stood GreenBridge Energy headquarters, the company he had believed in when very few others had, the company he still believed in now. As he walked toward the station exit, his phone vibrated. The message came from his financial advisor. Safe travels today. Try not to buy another company. Thomas laughed. The same joke had survived nearly 10 years. He typed a quick reply. No promises. Then slipped the phone back into his pocket. Most people who read financial newspapers would have been surprised to learn how little Thomas resembled their image of a major investor. He did not own a yacht. He did not collect luxury cars. He rarely appeared at industry events. And he had absolutely no interest in being photographed. Success had changed his financial situation. It had never changed his personality. The taxi ride to GreenBridge headquarters took nearly 30 minutes. As the city passed outside the window, Thomas reviewed several notes he had made during the previous week. Not financial notes. Not earnings projections. Questions. Simple questions. Questions about culture. Questions about leadership. Questions about communication. Questions about trust. Because while financial reports could tell him what a company was doing, they rarely revealed why people were doing it. And lately, Thomas had become curious. GreenBridge Energy was succeeding. Exceptionally succeeding. Revenue was strong. Expansion plans were ambitious. Investors appeared pleased. The future looked bright. Yet something in the quarterly reports felt different. Subtle. Difficult to explain. Almost as if the company had begun speaking a different language than it once had. Thomas couldn't prove it. But he had learned long ago to pay attention to instincts, especially when they refused to disappear. The taxi turned a corner, and suddenly GreenBridge Energy appeared. The headquarters tower rose above the surrounding buildings. Glass, steel, modern architecture. Large digital displays showed images of solar farms, wind turbines, and renewable energy projects around the world. The building looked successful, impressive, powerful. Everything the struggling startup of 20 years ago had once dreamed of becoming. Thomas smiled. The sight genuinely pleased him. Success deserved to be celebrated. But as the taxi slowed toward the entrance, another thought entered his mind, one he had been considering throughout the journey. A company could become larger. A company could become richer. A company could become more influential. The real question was whether it could grow without losing itself. That was what Thomas hoped to discover today. Not as an investor, not as a shareholder, but as a steward, someone entrusted with helping protect something valuable. The taxi stopped at the curb. Thomas picked up the old leather briefcase, paid the driver, and stepped onto the sidewalk. Across the street, employees hurried toward the entrance, carrying coffee and laptops. Most passed without noticing him. A few smiled politely. Thomas returned the gesture, then looked up at the company he had helped save 20 years earlier. For a moment, he simply stood there, observing, remembering, wondering. Then he crossed the street and walked toward the entrance. Inside, a young investor relations coordinator named Evelyn Brooks was about to make a very different first impression than the executives waiting upstairs. And before the day was over, GreenBridge Energy would receive a lesson about stewardship from the one person least interested in power. The lobby of GreenBridge Energy looked more like a technology company than an energy company. Sunlight poured through walls of glass. Large digital displays showcased renewable energy projects from around the world. Wind farms rotated slowly across enormous screens. Solar installations stretched across deserts and rooftops. Interactive exhibits highlighted innovations the company hoped would shape the future. Visitors often stopped to admire the displays. Thomas Bennett did as well. Not because he was impressed, because he remembered when none of it existed. 20 years earlier, GreenBridge had occupied 2 rented rooms above a printing company. The entire operation had fit comfortably inside a space smaller than the modern reception area. Thomas smiled. The company had come a long way. The receptionist looked up. "Good morning, sir." "Good morning. Can I help you?" Thomas nodded. "I have a visitor appointment." The receptionist checked the system. A moment later, her expression brightened. "Of course." She pointed toward a nearby seating area. "Someone from Investor Relations will be with you shortly." Thomas thanked her and sat down. The old leather briefcase rested beside his chair. Employees moved through the lobby carrying laptops, coffee cups, and presentation folders. The building buzzed with activity, energy, purpose, ambition. It reminded Thomas of why he had invested in the company in the first place. A few minutes later, a young woman approached. "Mr. Bennett?" Thomas stood. "Yes." She extended her hand. "Evelyn Brooks, Investor Relations." Her handshake was confident and professional, not overly formal, not overly familiar. "Exactly right. Pleased to meet you," Thomas said. "You as well." Unlike many people Thomas met at corporate events, Evelyn showed no signs of rushing the interaction. She did not glance at her phone. She did not look over his shoulder. She simply gave him her full attention. Thomas noticed immediately. People always revealed themselves in small moments. "How was your trip?" Evelyn asked. "Very pleasant." "Good." She smiled. "We're happy that you're here." The statement sounded sincere. Thomas appreciated that. As they began walking toward the elevators, several senior executives crossed the lobby. Most barely noticed them. One offered a polite nod. Another smiled briefly. Nothing unusual. Nothing memorable. Then a voice called from nearby. Evelyn. She turned. 3 executives stood near a conference area, reviewing presentation materials. Among them was Marcus Whitaker, Executive Vice President, one of GreenBridge Energy's rising stars. Marcus glanced toward Thomas, then back toward Evelyn. Can I borrow you for a minute? Of course. She turned to Thomas. I'll be right back. Thomas nodded. No hurry. The executives gathered around a digital display. Thomas remained nearby, not intentionally listening, simply too close not to hear. Who is that? One executive asked quietly. Evelyn answered. A shareholder. The executive nodded. Small shareholder? Evelyn looked at him calmly. A shareholder. I think that's what matters. For a brief moment, nobody replied. Then another executive smiled. He picked the wrong day. A few chuckles followed. Everyone suddenly wants FaceTime with leadership. More laughter. Marcus looked briefly toward Thomas, then shrugged. Let's hope he isn't planning to explain how to run the company. The group laughed. Not cruelly, not loudly. The sort of casual laughter people share when they assume nobody important is listening. Evelyn's smile faded slightly. Something about the conversation bothered her. Not because it was offensive, because it felt dismissive. Marcus noticed. Relax. He smiled. We deal with this every shareholder meeting. Another executive added. Everybody owns 10 shares and suddenly thinks they're Warren Buffett. More laughter. Evelyn didn't join in. Across the lobby, Thomas sat quietly. His expression never changed. No irritation. No offense. No embarrassment. Only observation. The same observation he had been practicing for decades. A few moments later, Evelyn returned. I'm sorry about that. Thomas smiled. No need. The elevator doors opened. They stepped inside. As the doors closed, Evelyn glanced toward him. Something had been bothering her since the conversation. Finally, she spoke. I hope nobody made you uncomfortable. Thomas looked at her, then smiled gently. Not at all. The answer seemed genuine, yet somehow Evelyn felt he had understood far more than he was saying. The elevator continued upward, floor after floor passing silently. What would you like to see while you're here? Evelyn asked. Thomas considered the question, then answered. The people. Evelyn looked surprised. The people? Thomas nodded. Financial reports tell me how a company performs. He smiled. People tell me who the company has become. For a moment, Evelyn simply stared, then smiled, because it was one of the most unusual answers she had ever heard from an investor. Meanwhile, several floors above them, Marcus Whitaker and his colleagues continued preparing presentations for the afternoon's shareholder event. Confident, successful, completely unaware that the quiet man carrying the old leather briefcase had already begun learning far more about GreenBridge Energy than any quarterly report could ever reveal. Shortly before noon, shareholders and executives began gathering in GreenBridge Energy's main conference auditorium. The room reflected everything the company had become. Large digital displays lined the walls. Images of wind farms, solar installations, and battery storage projects rotated across enormous screens. Rows of seats gradually filled with investors, analysts, board members, and company representatives. Conversations flowed easily. Coffee cups rested beside presentation folders. The atmosphere felt optimistic, confident, successful. Exactly the sort of environment GreenBridge Energy had spent years building. Thomas Bennett stood quietly near one of the side aisles, his old leather briefcase resting beside him. No one paid much attention to him, which suited him perfectly. A few seats away, Evelyn Brooks organized materials for the investor relations team. As shareholders continued arriving, she noticed something interesting. Many people entered the room looking for information. Thomas appeared to be looking for understanding. It was a subtle difference, but she was beginning to recognize it. A few minutes later, the meeting officially began. The chairman welcomed everyone. The company's recent performance was reviewed. Financial results were presented. Expansion projects were discussed. Future growth projections appeared on the massive screens. The numbers were impressive, very impressive. Several shareholders nodded approvingly throughout the presentations. Some took notes. Others quietly exchanged satisfied smiles. GreenBridge Energy was succeeding. Nobody questioned that. The first presentation focused on operational performance. A senior executive proudly outlined several major improvements introduced during the previous year. Efficiency had increased. Costs had decreased. Production had exceeded expectations. The room responded with polite applause. The results were clearly positive. When the applause ended, the chairman opened the floor for questions. Several hands rose immediately. Thomas waited, listening, observing, allowing others to speak first. Eventually, he raised his hand. The chairman nodded. "Yes, sir." Thomas stood. The room barely noticed. To most people, he appeared to be just another shareholder. "The results are impressive," Thomas said. The executive smiled. "Thank you." Thomas nodded, then asked a simple question. What did employees think about the changes? The room became unexpectedly quiet. The executive blinked. "As far as I know, they were satisfied." Thomas smiled politely. "You asked them?" For a brief moment, nobody spoke. The executive hesitated, not because he disagreed, because he hadn't. Eventually, he replied, "We monitored employee feedback through our normal channels." Thomas nodded. "Thank you." The presentation continued. But several people found themselves thinking about the question long after the discussion had moved on, including Evelyn. Later, another executive presented plans for a major expansion initiative. New facilities, new partnerships, new investment opportunities. The future appeared promising. The room listened attentively. Again, the chairman invited questions. Again, Thomas raised his hand. The executive smiled professionally. "Yes, sir." Thomas glanced toward one of the projected maps. "How are local communities responding to these projects?" The executive frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "The communities where these facilities will be built." A brief silence followed. "We haven't received any significant objections." Thomas nodded. "Thank you." The answer had addressed resistance, not relationships. A subtle distinction, yet Thomas noticed it immediately. So did Evelyn. As the meeting continued, a pattern gradually emerged. The presentations were excellent. The leadership team was talented. The company was performing well. Yet most discussions focused on outcomes: revenue, growth, market share, expansion, efficiency. Far fewer discussions focused on responsibility. The difference was small, but Thomas had spent decades learning that small differences often become large ones. Near the end of the morning session, Marcus Whitaker stepped onto the stage. His presentation focused on GreenBridge Energy's 5-year strategic plan. The room immediately became attentive. Marcus had a reputation for delivering exceptional presentations. Today was no exception. The strategy was ambitious, confident, well-researched. Growth projections appeared strong. Investors seemed pleased. Several executives exchanged approving glances. When Marcus finished, applause filled the room. He smiled, confidently, comfortably, exactly as expected. Then the chairman opened the floor for questions one final time. Thomas raised his hand. Marcus recognized him immediately, and despite himself, felt a flicker of irritation. The older man had been asking questions all morning, perfectly reasonable questions, but somehow they left executives feeling strangely uncomfortable. Marcus forced a polite smile. "Yes, Mr. Thomas Bennett." Marcus nodded. "Mr. Bennett." Thomas glanced toward one of the projected charts. "The growth projections are impressive." "Thank you," Thomas nodded, then asked, "What would success look like if revenue wasn't included?" Silence. Several shareholders looked up from their notes. The room seemed to pause. Marcus blinked. "I'm not sure I understand." Thomas smiled. "Then perhaps that's the question." No one spoke. For several seconds the room remained completely still. Finally Marcus crossed his arms. Not aggressively, but noticeably. "With respect, Mr. Bennett." The room became attentive. These decisions are more complicated than they appear from the outside. The sentence lingered in the air. Thomas looked at him calmly, then nodded. "I'm sure they are." Nothing more. No argument. No lecture. No attempt to embarrass anyone. And somehow that felt more uncomfortable than disagreement would have. Several minutes later, the chairman stood. "We'll break for lunch and continue at 1:30. The room immediately relaxed. Conversations resumed. Chairs moved. Presentation materials were gathered. People began making their way toward the dining area, prepared for shareholders and guests. Small groups quickly formed around the room. Executives discussed presentations. Investors compared notes. Coffee cups appeared. The atmosphere became far more informal. Thomas stood near one of the windows, overlooking the city. A cup of coffee rested in one hand. His old leather briefcase stood beside him. He seemed perfectly content standing alone, watching, thinking. A few moments later, Evelyn approached. "Can I ask you something?" Thomas smiled. "Of course." She hesitated, then spoke. "Do you always ask questions like that?" Thomas laughed softly. "Only when I care about the answer." For a moment they stood quietly beside the window, watching the activity around them. Across the room, Marcus and several executives continued discussing growth projections, expansion plans, future opportunities, the same topics that had dominated the entire morning. Evelyn followed Thomas's gaze, then found herself thinking about the questions he had asked, not because they challenged the presentations, because they challenged something deeper, the way people thought about the company itself. For years she had listened to discussions about growth, performance, and strategy, yet Thomas seemed interested in something entirely different: culture, responsibility, purpose, the things a company should protect once success arrived. And for the first time all day, Evelyn realized how much she liked the way Thomas Bennett thought about leading a company and how leadership affected everyone who came into contact with it. Employees, investors, communities, customers. Thomas Bennett seemed to see the company differently, not as power, not as authority, not as a machine designed only to produce results, but as something entrusted to people for a time, something they were responsible for leaving better than they found it, somehow that felt closer to what GreenBridge Energy was supposed to be. She wasn't entirely sure why, but she had a feeling the afternoon session would answer that question. And before the shareholder meeting ended, everyone in the building would be forced to think about the company very differently. The afternoon session began shortly after 1:30. Shareholders gradually returned to the auditorium, carrying coffee cups and presentation materials. Conversations settled. Seats filled. The atmosphere felt relaxed, comfortable. Most people expected another series of presentations, followed by a routine vote. Nothing unusual. Nothing unexpected. Thomas Bennett returned to his former place. The old leather briefcase rested beside him, exactly where he had left it. He appeared perfectly content, as though the morning discussions had answered every question he had hoped to ask. Across the room, Marcus Whitaker reviewed several notes for the final presentation. The morning had gone well. Very well. Investors seemed satisfied. The growth strategy had been received positively. And despite a few unusual questions from an older shareholder named Thomas Bennett, the meeting remained firmly on track. At least that was how Marcus saw it. Evelyn Brooks took her place near the side of the auditorium. She found herself glancing toward Thomas. The lunch conversation lingered in her mind. There was something unusual about him. Not his appearance. Not his questions. His perspective. The chairman stepped to the podium. The room gradually became quiet. "Thank you, everyone." He smiled. "We have one final item before concluding today's meeting." Several shareholders adjusted in their seats. Most expected another procedural announcement. Instead, the chairman smiled. A different smile. The kind people wear when discussing something personally meaningful. Every company has moments that define its future. The room listened attentively. GreenBridge Energy had one of those moments 20 years ago. A photograph appeared on the screen. An old photograph. Grainy. Slightly faded. The image showed a much younger GreenBridge team, standing outside a modest office building. The company looked nothing like it did today. A few people smiled. Some executives recognized the photograph immediately. Others did not. The chairman continued. At the time, GreenBridge Energy was facing serious financial difficulties. The room became quieter. Several investors had already withdrawn their support. Another photograph appeared. Construction equipment. Half-finished projects. Employees working under difficult conditions. We were weeks away from shutting down operations. Marcus watched attentively. He knew the story. Most executives did. Then the chairman smiled again. "And there is one reason why we survived." The room became completely silent. One person believed in this company when almost nobody else did. Several board members exchanged knowing smiles. One person invested when others were leaving. The chairman looked toward the audience. One person gave GreenBridge Energy enough time to become what it is today. A spotlight wasn't necessary. Somehow the entire room instinctively began looking around. The chairman extended a hand toward the audience. Thomas Bennett. Silence. Complete silence. Then hundreds of heads turned toward the older man, standing quietly with an old leather briefcase. Marcus froze. For a moment his mind simply refused to process what he had heard. Thomas Bennett. The same Thomas Bennett. The shareholder. The man asking questions. The man he had dismissed. The man he had repeatedly assumed was looking at the company from the outside. The chairman continued. Mr. Bennett remains our largest individual shareholder. The room erupted into applause. Many shareholders stood immediately. Several executives followed. Board members smiled warmly. Thomas looked mildly embarrassed by the attention, which somehow made the moment even more powerful. Slowly he offered a polite nod and waited for the applause to subside. Marcus remained seated, not intentionally, simply stunned. His mind replayed the entire day. The lobby, the jokes, the assumptions, the questions, the strategy session. And suddenly he understood something. Thomas Bennett had not spent the day trying to challenge GreenBridge Energy. He had spent the day trying to understand it. The realization struck harder than any public criticism could have. Nearby, Evelyn felt herself smiling, not because Thomas had turned out to be important, because his questions suddenly made perfect sense. The chairman continued. Many of our newer employees have never met Mr. Bennett. A few people laughed, which is understandable. He smiled toward Thomas. Thomas has always preferred listening to speaking. And after today's discussions, I suspect many of you have discovered that he is exceptionally good at both. More laughter followed. Thomas smiled, but said nothing. The chairman looked toward him. Thomas, would you care to say a few words before we conclude? The room immediately became attentive. Marcus especially, because for the first time all day, he realized he genuinely wanted to hear the answer. And as Thomas Bennett slowly walked toward the stage, carrying the same old leather briefcase he had carried through the front doors that morning, GreenBridge Energy was about to receive a lesson far more valuable than any growth projection. For several moments, the applause continued. Shareholders stood. Board members smiled. Executives joined in. The atmosphere felt warm, respectful, genuine. Thomas Bennett waited patiently beside the podium. The old leather briefcase rested near his feet, as though it had attended hundreds of meetings before this one, which, in a sense, it had. Eventually the applause faded. The room became quiet once more. Thomas stepped toward the microphone. Thank you. His voice was calm, unhurried, the voice of a man, entirely comfortable, speaking to a room full of strangers. I've never been particularly fond of standing on stages. A few people laughed. And after watching today's presentations, I'm even less convinced I belong on one. More laughter followed. Even Marcus smiled. Thomas waited for the room to settle, then looked around, slowly, carefully, as though he genuinely wanted to see every person present. When I first invested in GreenBridge Energy, nobody thought it was a good idea. Several shareholders laughed knowingly. My financial advisor certainly didn't. More laughter. My family wasn't especially enthusiastic either. The room laughed again. Thomas smiled. To be fair, they had excellent reasons. The mood remained light, comfortable, Then Thomas became more thoughtful. The truth is, I didn't invest because I thought GreenBridge would make me wealthy. The room grew quieter. I invested because I believed the company was trying to do something worthwhile. Several executives nodded. 20 years ago, that mattered. He paused. I believe it still does. The room became completely silent. Thomas looked toward the giant screens, displaying growth projections and expansion plans. Today, we discussed revenue. He nodded. We discussed market share. Another nod. We discussed growth. Again, all important things. No one disagreed. Then Thomas asked a question. But what exactly are they for? Silence. The question hung in the room, not because people lacked answers, because they had stopped asking it. Thomas continued. A company can grow. It can become profitable. It can become influential. None of those things tell us whether it remains worthy of success. The room listened carefully, even Marcus, especially Marcus. I've spent most of today listening. A few people smiled. That sounded exactly like Thomas Bennett. And I've noticed something. The room remained silent. We talk a great deal about managing assets, managing projects, managing performance. Then he paused. We talk much less about serving people. No one moved. Employees, investors, communities, customers, the very groups GreenBridge Energy existed to support. Thomas continued. Many people believe companies belong to executives. A few heads turned toward Marcus. Thomas smiled gently. I don't. The room became completely still. Some people believe companies belong to shareholders. Thomas shook his head. I don't believe that either. Several investors exchanged curious glances. Thomas looked around the room. I believe companies are entrusted to us. The silence deepened. Founders, executives, employees, investors. For a period of time, we are asked to protect something larger than ourselves. That responsibility is called stewardship. The word seemed to settle across the auditorium. Stewardship. Not ownership, not control, responsibility. Thomas nodded slowly. The moment we begin believing that the company exists for us, we stop asking whether we exist for the company. No one spoke, because everyone understood exactly what he meant. Marcus most of all. The events of the day replayed inside his mind. The assumptions, the jokes, the impatience, the dismissiveness. Not toward Thomas Bennett, toward anyone who seemed unimportant. And suddenly he understood the real problem. The culture had not become disrespectful. It had become selective. Some people mattered more than others, at least in practice, and that was never how stewardship worked. Thomas looked toward Marcus, not harshly, not accusingly, simply honestly. Marcus Whitaker. Marcus stood immediately. The room became attentive. Thomas smiled. Your presentation was excellent. The compliment surprised Marcus, because it was sincere. The strategy is strong. The growth plan is impressive. Several executives nodded. Everything Thomas said was true. Then he continued. But leadership requires more than building a successful company. The room remained silent. It requires protecting the reason the company became successful in the first place. Marcus lowered his eyes, not out of embarrassment, out of understanding. For the first time all day, he saw exactly what Thomas had been trying to show him. After several moments, Marcus nodded. "I understand." Thomas smiled. "I think you're beginning to." A few people laughed softly, including Marcus. The tension eased. Then Thomas delivered the line that would stay with Marcus for years. "You've learned how to grow a company." He paused. "Now learn how to serve one." Complete silence. Not uncomfortable silence. Meaningful silence. The kind that appears when everyone knows they have just heard something important. Marcus nodded slowly. "I will." And Thomas believed him. Finally, Thomas looked toward Evelyn Brooks. She immediately looked surprised. The room smiled. Thomas smiled too. "Evelyn, you reminded me of something today." The young investor relations coordinator looked completely unprepared for the attention. Thomas continued. "When someone asked whether I was a small shareholder, a few executives shifted uncomfortably. You answered, 'A shareholder.' I think that's what matters." The room became quiet again. Thomas smiled. "That answer told me something important." He looked around the auditorium. "It told me she already understands stewardship." Then he turned toward the chairman and the leadership team. "With your agreement, I would like to make a proposal." The chairman smiled. "Please." Thomas nodded. "As GreenBridge continues to grow, I believe we should strengthen how we communicate with shareholders, employees, customers, and the communities we serve." He glanced toward Evelyn. "And if the leadership team agrees, I would like Evelyn Brooks to help lead that effort." The room became attentive. Several executives exchanged thoughtful looks. The chairman nodded first. Then several board members followed. Finally, Marcus spoke. "I think that's an excellent idea." More voices agreed. Thomas smiled. "Then perhaps GreenBridge Energy has found its first director of stakeholder relations." The room erupted into applause. Warm, genuine, deserved. Evelyn looked completely overwhelmed, which somehow made everyone applaud even harder. As the applause continued, Thomas stepped back from the microphone. The lesson was finished. The company was still successful, still growing, still ambitious. But perhaps now, it remembered something important. Success was not something to own. It was something to care for, something to protect, something to leave better than you found it. Thomas picked up the old leather briefcase, looked around the auditorium one final time, then smiled. GreenBridge Energy would continue growing. That was never the question. The question was whether it would grow while remembering what it existed to serve. And as Thomas Bennett walked away from the stage, he felt more confident about the answer than he had that morning.